I'm Tom Melvin, and I'm one of the program directors at Yellow Dog Flyfishing, and today I'm going to talk to you about packing for a trip to Alaska.
Okay, Tom, ready when you are.
So now we're going to talk about flies for a trip to Alaska. Alaska is unique in the fact that almost all lodges and outfitters do provide flies and terminal tackle in your package already. So you could literally show up with 0 flies or terminal tackle, and the lodges or outfitters that have you covered with everything you need. I always like to show up with at least a few flies and some tackle just in case I'm fishing on my own or I want to get a little bit of extra time fishing in after dinner. So it's always a good idea to have at least a few flies on you. If you do want to bring all your own flies, that's great. If you don't want to bring flies, that's okay too. But these are just some flies that we've found to work really well in Alaska. There's a ton of different patterns you can use up there. Typically the fish aren't too picky, but this is just kind of a standard selection of a few different things to keep in mind as far as your patterns go. As far as the trout patterns for rainbows, Arctic char, Dolly Varden, grayling, typically like to have a variety of different patterns, including streamers, mice, a handful of dry flies. As far as the streamer patterns go, a lot of stuff will work. I would say the fly that kind of reigns supreme up there is definitely the Dalai Lama fly. Killer pattern that fishes super well for the trout species. It also fishes really good for salmon too. Nice and heavy, it's got a lot of movement. It has a stinger hook on it, so it tends to get a lot of good hookups, but Dalai Lamas come in a variety of different colors. I typically like the natural colors a little bit better. So olive, white, black and white is great. They even make some with eggs on the front. So like egg sucking Dalai Lamas, these are awesome too. But if you were gonna go up there with one streamer, you could literally go up there with just the Dalai Lama and do just fine. So definitely be sure you have some Dalai Lamas. I also like leech patterns, anything black, olive, any sculpin patterns work great too. Any of Kelly's patterns are awesome. So sculpins, leeches. There are some rivers up there where you're not allowed to fish articulated streamers, or it's only like one hook. So if your guide cuts off the front hook of your fly, don't worry about it, it'll still fish just fine. Any of Kelly's sculpin patterns, any leeches work great. I also like to have some smolt patterns, such as a skittish smolt. These work super well kind of early season, imitating the salmon fry up there. So any bright flashy smolt patterns work awesome. But yeah, I typically for streamers say Dalai Lamas, leeches, sculpins, smolt, and you'll be covered pretty much on everything. If you are going to bring all your own flies, I would say for a week of fishing, having 18 to 24 streamer patterns will have you more than covered. So those are your trout streamers. As far as mouse patterns, if you've never mouse fished, Alaska is a great place to do it, and I would definitely recommend giving it a shot while you're up there. There are a ton of different mouse patterns. The ones that I've found to work the best and all the guides fish up there, really only 2 that you need would be the Moorish mouse patterns or the Mr. Hankies. Both of them are great. They're super durable. A lot of other mouse patterns will work, but really the only 2 that you need is the Moorish mouse patterns or the Mr. Hanky. And as far as numbers go, I'd say, half a dozen will cover you. As far as your dry fly patterns go, Alaska is typically not known as a dry fly fishery like you might find in the US West or Patagonia. but there definitely is some opportunities to fish dry flies up there. So I always recommend having at least a handful of kind of standard dry fly patterns. You don't need to get super technical or tricky here. A lot of dry flies will work. I typically recommend having, a small selection of kind of your standard mayflies. So anything like parachute Adams, Madam X's, something big and bushy works great. So a handful of kind of standard mayflies. I also like to have a handful of big elk hair caddis, just your standard elk hair caddis, tan, olive, nice and big, size 8 to 12 works great. But a few caddis, and then I also like to have a few just big kind of attractor patterns, like the Fat Albert beetle is awesome up there. It floats well. You can hang a nymph off of it if you want to. But a few Fat Alberts. The Hippie Stomper is also an awesome fly up there too. But just having kind of a handful of kind of standard dry flies just in case you see some rising fish. Over the course of a week, I'd say having a dozen dry flies in a variety of different patterns, and you'll be totally covered. As far as other fly patterns go, I would definitely have a few flesh flies as well, especially if you're fishing late season. These are great at imitating the salmon flesh that is in the river when the sockeyes are spawning. That's typically kind of later on, August, September. One thing that you will definitely see up there, especially if you go late season, August or September, would be a bead box. And this is imitating the salmon eggs that are being dropped into the river by the sockeyes. This is kind of matching your hatch Alaskan style. Every guide up there has a bead box. I would recommend most anglers heading up there, don't worry about taking your own beads unless you really want to and you think you'll be fishing beads or eggs a lot in the future. Guides up there, they get real specific about their beads as far as size. A lot of them paint them with nail polish to imitate kind of the different colorations of the salmon eggs up there. So I would just recommend using your guide's beads or eggs. They have a million of them, so don't worry about it. But you'll definitely see this up there, and that would be imitating the salmon eggs kind of late season, August, September for the trout species. As far as salmon flies, I would definitely recommend bringing a handful of salmon flies along with you as well. The area of Alaska receives all 5 runs of Pacific salmon over the course of the summer, so you should have some opportunities to fish for salmon if you want to. Salmon flies, they're usually a little bit bigger, super flashy with colors, pinks, purples, chartreuse, blues, they all work great. So having a handful of salmon flies is also super important. Dalai Lamas, they also get tied in kind of some crazy colors like pink and chartreuse. This will fish well for trout too, but is a killer salmon pattern as well. So having a handful of salmon patterns is definitely a good idea. Over the course of the week, if you were going to spend some time fishing for salmon, I'd recommend just, a dozen salmon flies just to have with you just in case. If you're going during a time when you're really going to be more focused on salmon, whether it's, kings or silvers, you could definitely kind of stack the deck a little bit more to have more salmon flies. But over the course of the week, if you're going to spend a couple days fishing for salmon, having a dozen salmon flies is always a good idea. There are definitely certain areas too where you have opportunities for other species like northern pike or lake trout. There are some areas that are way more focused on that, like the Yukon with midnight sun. But other areas where there's trout fishing and salmon, you might have some opportunities for some pike as well. So I always like to throw in just a few pike flies too, such as the bunny fly. This one is kind of a standard go-to, tied in a variety of different colors. Red and white is kind of a staple, got some flash on it. They also make it in kind of some crazy colors like chartreuse and red. Pretty much anything will work as long as it gets in front of the fish and they're willing to eat. I also like to have a couple topwater flies too, like the Umpqua pike fly. Chugs a lot of water, makes a lot of movement. It's a really fun experience to get a pike on top water. So having just a couple pike flies mixed in there is always a great idea wherever you're heading in Alaska. As far as your fly boxes go, I typically like to have kind of one larger box for your streamers, maybe salmon flies and mouse patterns. These are big flies, so having a nice big box to kind of keep them all in is great. You can throw this in your backpack and kind of take them all with you. So I'll usually have one big box for, all streamers and kind of big flies, maybe one smaller box for your dry flies or anything kind of smaller, just to keep kind of your small flies all together. And then I always like to have kind of one small box too. This small box, I'll actually put it in my wader pocket in the front of my wader. So if I am, wading away from the guides or fishing on my own, you just have a small box of flies on you. If you break one off and need to change out really quickly, it's nice to have just a few small flies with you on you just in case. So that's what I'd kind of recommend as a general selection for fishing in Alaska. Again, a lot of the lodges and outfitters up in Alaska do provide all flies and terminal tackle in your package. So you could literally show up with 0 flies. If you do want to bring your own, that's great. And this is just kind of a general selection of what we've found to work up there. Find out more about fishing in Alaska at yellowdogflyfishing.com.